There is a specific kind of pain that is different from ordinary disappointment. It is the pain of hoping, again, that someone is going to change, of watching them make the same choice for the seventh time and finding somewhere in yourself the same fragile expectation that this time will be different, of investing in potential you can see clearly and waiting for the person to become the version of themselves you know is possible. Most of us have someone like this in our lives, and the question that psychology can genuinely help answer, not with judgment, but with honest, evidence based clarity, is whether change is possible for this person. Not whether people in general can change. Of course they can. The question is whether this specific type of person, organized in this specific psychological way, then is likely to change without conditions that are far more significant than anything a relationship typically provides. Today, drawing on research from Harvard Medical School's Personality Research Unit, the work of Dr. Otto Kernberg at Weill Cornell Medicine, and the Minnesota Longitudinal Study, we examined 5 specific psychological types for whom change, at least the kind of change that would make the relationship sustainable, is, for practical purposes, unlikely without major life events, sustained professional intervention, or both. The first type is the person with a consolidated narcissistic personality structure. And I want to be careful here to distinguish between narcissistic traits, which most people have to some degree, and a consolidated narcissistic personality structure, which is a significantly different and more stable configuration. Dr. Otto Kernberg, a psychiatrist at Weill Cornell Medicine, whose theoretical and clinical work on personality disorders is among the most influential in the field, describes narcissistic personality structure as being organized around a specific internal configuration, a grandiose self that is defended against an underlying sense of worthlessness through constant external validation, the devaluation of others, and an inability to sustain the experience of genuine intimacy. The reason people with consolidated narcissistic structures rarely change in the context of ordinary relationships is neurological as much as psychological. Genuine change requires the capacity to hold a painful self-perception without immediately defending against it. To sit in the discomfort of recognizing one's own contribution to harm. This sitting in discomfort is exactly what the narcissistic structure is organized to prevent. The entire system, the grandiosity, the blame shifting, the entitlement, the cold devaluation when challenged, exists to prevent the individual from experiencing the underlying sense of inadequacy that Kernberg identifies as the structural core. In a relationship, you will see the pattern repeat precisely because the relationship does not provide the conditions under which structural change is possible. Structural change of this kind requires, at minimum, sustained intensive psychotherapy with a skilled practitioner. Not because the person is beyond help, but because the work required goes to a depth that ordinary life experience cannot access. The relationship cannot do what years of careful clinical work can only sometimes accomplish. The second type is the person whose behavior pattern is a deeply consolidated trauma adaptation. And this type requires the most empathy alongside the most honest assessment. Research from the Minnesota Longitudinal Study, which has tracked 267 individuals from birth through their adult years, examining how early experience shapes adult behavior, documents what developmental researchers call the coherence of adaptation. The behavioral patterns that a child develops in response to their caregiving environment are, by definition, adaptations. They developed because they worked. Because they helped the child survive and navigate a specific relational world. The problem is that these adaptations are remarkably stable because they were built during critical developmental windows when neural systems were most plastic, and because they were rehearsed thousands of times before the person reached adulthood. The adult who pushes people away when they get close, who sabotages relationships at the point of deepest vulnerability, who creates conflict to establish distance, is not choosing this consciously. They are running an adaptation developed in childhood that said closeness precedes abandonment, intimacy precedes hurt, trusting someone means being in the position of being devastated by them. The adaptation is wrong about you, but it is built from accurate data from a different time. Why does this person resist change? Because the adaptation feels like self-preservation. Every therapeutic movement toward new patterns of relationship requires tolerating a period of vulnerability, opening to closeness without the protective distance, trusting without the escape plan. For someone whose entire history says that this vulnerability led to destruction, tolerating it long enough for the new pattern to consolidate is an act of extraordinary courage. Many people, confronted with the felt danger of this process, retreat to the familiar pattern, not because they don't want to change, because the change feels at the level of the nervous system like a survival threat. The third type is the person with an addictive or compulsive behavior that has become the primary organizer of their life. Whether that addiction is to substances, to process behaviors, gambling, spending, work, screens, or to relational patterns, chaos, unavailable partners, conflict. Dr. Theodore Millon, whose foundational personality research at Harvard Medical School and the University of Miami shaped our understanding of personality organization, identified a key feature of addictive personality configurations. The behavior functions as a primary regulatory mechanism. It is not just something the person does, it is how they manage emotional states, tolerate discomfort, and structure their internal experience. Mean to remove the addictive behavior without replacing its regulatory function is to remove the person's primary coping mechanism without providing a substitute. This is why the promise to change, made sincerely in a moment of genuine distress about the consequences of the behavior, so reliably does not sustain. It is not because the person is dishonest, it is because the removal of the behavior leaves the underlying dysregulation unaddressed, and the dysregulation generates inexorably the behavior that reduces it. The person is trying to hold back water with their hands. Change requires an alternative source of regulation, therapeutic skill building, neurological rewiring through consistent new behaviors, often pharmacological support. Not willpower, applied to a system that willpower cannot reach. In relationships, this means that sustained hope for change in the absence of structured professional support is not hope based on realistic probability. It is hope based on caring about someone, which is an entirely different thing. The caring is real and valid. The probability calculation is a separate question. The fourth type is the person who is temperamentally and neurologically oriented toward high dominance, low agreeableness, and low openness to experience. A specific personality configuration that research suggests is among the most stable across the lifespan. Studies tracking personality trait stability from the 5-factor model, the most empirically validated personality framework in research psychology, then developed through work at multiple universities, including the University of Oregon and the National Institute on Aging, show that the traits of conscientiousness and agreeableness have some capacity for change, particularly under conditions of major life transitions. The traits of openness to experience and, most relevantly here, neuroticism combined with low agreeableness are among the most stable. The person who is chronically disagreeable, who responds to most attempts at conversation with contradiction or dismissal, who finds cooperation difficult and competition natural, who has operated this way consistently across decades and across different relationships and contexts. This is not a pattern that is likely to respond to a partner's requests for change. The pattern is constitutional, consolidated, and in many cases represents the person's honest assessment that they are not the one who needs to change. Research on behavior change in this temperamental profile, which often co-occurs with high subclinical psychopathy scores, suggests that this type of person changes only when the personal cost of not changing becomes sufficiently concrete and immediate. Abstract appeals to the relationship's well-being, to the partner's feelings, to long-term consequences. These do not register at the motivational level that produces behavioral change. Only immediate, concrete, inescapable consequences have demonstrated efficacy. And in personal relationships, providing those consequences consistently is almost never possible. The fifth type brings us to a paradox that is, in some ways, the most important to understand. The person who is fully capable of change, who has even made some genuine changes, but for whom those changes will not translate into the relationship you are hoping to have. This is the person who needs to do their work, pray, and who may genuinely do it, but who needs to do it away from the relationship, away from you, in conditions that the current relationship cannot provide. Research from the field of relational therapy, drawing particularly on work from the Gottman Institute's longitudinal studies of relationship trajectories, shows that some of the most important personal growth following the end of a relationship occurs in the period after the relationship ends. The pattern that was so entrenched in the relationship context becomes, in its absence, more visible, more workable, and ultimately more addressable. This type is perhaps the most heartbreaking because the potential is real. The change is genuinely possible. It may even happen. But the relationship was not the container in which it could occur. And holding on, hoping that it will occur within the relationship, is keeping both people from the conditions in which they might actually grow. The question for each of these 5 types is not, can this person change? In the abstract, with the right conditions, over a long enough timeline, most psychological patterns are workable at some level. The real question is whether the change that is possible is likely to happen in the time frame, with the resources, and within the relationship context you are currently in. That is a question only honest self-examination can answer. The 5 psychological types we've examined today, the consolidated narcissistic structure, the entrenched trauma adaptation, the addiction organized life, the high dominance, low agreeableness constitutional profile, and the person who needs to grow outside the relationship are not categories of people who deserve to be given up on. They are categories of people for whom ordinary relational investment and hope-driven persistence are unlikely, on their own, to produce the change you need. Understanding this is not about giving up. It is about calibrating your investment accurately. Giving someone the benefit of the doubt is reasonable. Giving them the 7th benefit of the doubt, the 14th, the 22nd, at the cost of your own well-being, your own development, and your own finite and irreplaceable years is a different calculation, and you deserve to make it with clear eyes. Is there someone in your life who you've been hoping will change? Without naming names, tell us in the comments. How long have you been waiting?